Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Shay Ryan Douglas, and today, Thursday afternoon here in Far North Queensland, I'm joined with Dennis O'Connor from Awakening in Health. Welcome back. We usually do these conversations every Thursday, and it's an opportunity for us to explore what's going on in the world, what's relevant, how we can take action to move forward, but ultimately just have the discussion, have a good yarn between two strapping-looking blokes and have a bit of a laugh, but also talk about topics that is relevant to our times today as we are moving through some really interesting, turbulent, for some, tumultuous even at times, but times of change, I would suggest. And today's topic of conversation is all about life, the living, the vital, the moving, the energetic, and also about death, the unknown, the afterlife, all of these great topics. So what do you reckon, Dennis?
Absolutely. Let's get stuck in.
Yeah, cool. So we've got a couple of questions that we've popped in the description, but before we jump into it, I just wanted to thank you guys for watching. If you do like this video, please like it. If you found something that you didn't like, drop it in the comment section. We're usually pretty good at replying to those. And if you did find tremendous value, we just ask that you share it so that you could pass this on to your friends and family. And we really appreciate that. So thanks for watching. And so I guess my first question is, what does it mean to be alive?
Wow. I think, I wasn't expecting that one, Shay.
Straight into it.
I might just leave you and I might, no. I'm not, one of my comments on that might be, I'm not too sure if you can answer that. I don't think anybody could probably ever answer it, but I think it puts lots of different nuances on it if you have a little bit of an understanding about what it means to die. And I think I'm in a quite an interesting place because I accidentally fell into an area where I actually had to deal extensively with death. And I started out kind of as this young kid from Ireland when I was, I left home about 17 and a half, and I fell into accidentally doing a nursing course. And
what do you mean accidentally fell into a nursing course?
So I didn't know, I wanted to be a vet. And I didn't get the points to be able to get to study being a vet in Ireland because the demand for it was just insane, or it was too stupid. I'm going with the demand for it was too insane. And my sister at the time was a nurse, and she said, "Listen, you should study this. You can travel around the world, blah blah blah." And I kind of didn't really want to be a nurse. I was thinking it's kind of like gay and all this kind of stuff. And then she said, "Listen, at least you can do this pre-nursing course. And then, decide if you like it or not." So I had nothing to do. So I ended up doing this pre-nursing course. And I was the only guy in a class full of girls. I kind of thought, hello, wait a second, there's something to this. And I kind of accidentally stayed in there. I stayed in there. So I ended up doing my training in London. And when I was really green, I fell into doing what was called an acute care ward, which is really kind of high level. And I didn't know anywhere near enough to know that I probably shouldn't have done that kind of level of nursing because I was very inexperienced and there was people kind of dying around me. And as a result, like I can kind of still vividly remember, this little old Indian lady who I was kind of a year out of nursing who she had a stroke in this ward I was working in. And we became really good friends. So she was kind of in her 70s, I guess, at the time. And we used banter, and she couldn't move one side of her body. And we formed a really good bond, actually. Like when I would get onto the ward, we would have chats and whatnot. And she actually ended up having a cardiac arrest. And I was absolutely devastated at the time because she, to my mind, she had so much value still to offer. She had wisdom, all these things. But the doctors had put her, and I didn't realize this at the time, under a do not resuscitate order. So, and I was kind of desperate to try and get this lady saved, but I had to sit and watch her pass away. So it was quite a really very confronting, I guess, place to be in.
And what age were you at this time?
I would have to, around 19, I think.
Wow.
Yeah. And then I
studying.
I just finished at this stage. I was a year out, yeah. And even kind of towards the end of my study and in around there, I had these situations where we would have what are called crashes. And as a student, you're quite peripheral, but then the more you kind of know what goes on, you kind of find yourself being a little bit useful. So it starts out where you're in the back going, holy shit, what do I do? To a doctor screaming at you, pass me this. And you end up sticking a kind of I guess a pin in an IV bag and setting that up, and you hand it to the doctor, and then somebody comes along afterwards and say, wow, you did really well, thank you, and you're like, oh, I felt useless, I didn't know what to do. So then you realize, oh, at least I know how to do this. So you kind of hover when somebody crashes again, and you do something similar, and then you add a little bit, and somebody goes, oh wow, you did really good. So then I ended up traveling to Australia, and I noticed the two places where I could be guaranteed to have work were intensive care and mental health, because nobody really wanted to work there. And being a young guy, I kind of had that bravado, where I kind of thought, okay, I can do this. And again, I look back now and I think I was so far out of my depth, but I just had this courage to get in there and do this stuff. And as soon as it was identified that I could work in intensive care, I was just in demand to be a body in front of somebody who was quite sick. And you start off with people who are not on ventilators, and then you slowly progress to being able to run a ventilator. And my knowledge at that time was horrendous, but I at least knew that if an alarm went off, I would call somebody, so I was safe, which was something that was really, really valuable. And obviously, then in an intensive care setting, you have no choice, I guess, but to eventually be exposed to fairly serious incidences where you try to save people and they pass away.
Wow. So, I mean, to round it off around my question, what does it mean to be alive? Your experience in your life, where it's led you as a nurse, has been very confronted with death, essentially. So I guess we'll go in reverse then and really look at the death process.
Yeah.
And it seems to me, according to my experiences growing up, which has had very little to do with any experiences of death, outside of, a family member who has passed away and I'd be aware of, but maybe go to a funeral. I've never seen a dead body. I've never really had that, one-on-one or like really connected physical experience of witnessing death outside of some of my friends who I've lost, and been to a funeral, but never seen the body, whether it was in a coffin or whatever, and or cremated. And so it seems to me as well that outside of a funeral experience, common Western culture doesn't necessarily always have these regular processes for deep grieving for a person who's passed. And so from your experience, having worked daily in a space where you're seeing death quite regularly, how did that impact you to really be alive?
Yeah, it's sort of so many, as you're talking, I kind of have these little flashbacks of lots of these different situations I was involved in. And sometimes death was really beautiful, and sometimes death was just horrendous. And there's lots of different reasons for that. And sometimes it might be that we made a beautiful collective decision together to help somebody pass away in a graceful manner. Sometimes it was situations where people, and it's subjective, but to my mind, should have been allowed to pass away beautifully, but they just ended up being, I guess, not dragged through something which I think from a traditional point of view, we would never have allowed 100, 200, 300 years ago. And maybe their life extended in quite a horrific way unnecessarily, and then they passing. And then we had these, examples of great rescues where people should have died and we'd kind of take them back. And I think for me, one of the nuances to put on the whole life and death experience was not necessarily my own thoughts on it, but actually going through that journey of the people who were closest to the people who were dying. So, the hardest thing obviously was dealing with kids who died and being with the family of those children, the parents obviously. And then you have these other really strange kind of nuances of a daughter with her father or mother, or a son with their parents and our best friends. So many really intimate, and I do think I'm privileged to have been allowed in that group in those circumstances and just welcomed and being part of that grieving experience. It was quite incredible, and even now I'm getting goosebumps.
Super fascinating to have that opportunity, as you said, the privilege to work with people on that intimate level around, particularly when someone they love dies.
Yeah.
And it's something that I'm curious to explore in this conversation, mostly because the reality is what happens when we die.
Yeah.
we have no idea from this current framework of life that we're living, what we call living. We're alive, and so death, as we know it, is kind of like this endpoint, or it's, from the Western culture, it's a very sad moment. It's a moment of grieving. It's there's a lot of intense emotional experiences, as you said, having that intimacy with the family. It's like, wow, we lost someone, or based upon this three-dimensional physical experience that we're really grounded in, we have this perception that, or this belief that when someone dies, that is an endpoint, or it's over, it's finished. Yet that is a belief that we don't actually necessarily know is true. And so why that's relevant for me to explore, and my next question to you is, what happens when we die?
Yeah, and it's funny, I think when you say it's a question to me, it's a question not from you to me, but it's a question that I have as well. And I think we do have some answers, but we have no conviction that those answers are going to be accurate or not until we get somebody who comes back and tells us and proves it for us. So I think almost your question to me is rhetorical. Mm-hmm. And all I can do is just give you my opinion, which may be nowhere near what actually happens. But there's some incredible, I guess, after death experiences where people, talk about white lights and seeing visions and whatnot. And we unfortunately, I think in the modern world, have to box everything into these strict scientific boxes that are designed to either prove or disprove certain measures that we come up with beforehand. And if we have other measures outside of them, they are just either not considered or not counted. So how do you measure that? And I think for me, one of the hints that we can have about life and death is actually looking at some of the ancient texts around it. And I do think that many hundreds of years ago, people were more connected to spirituality. And I think this shift towards, almost a religion of scientism to a certain extent is not healthy, and it's taken away from us a lot of stuff. And I personally do think that if we actually look at science, we can take some hints there as well, that energy, apparently we can't destroy or create it. It just moves from one area to the other. So just going by that alone, you would have to think that there's something that moves beyond maybe a 3D realm into something else.
Yeah, wow. I love this conversation and where it's gone, how it's evolving. And so fundamentally, these are existential questions of life that seems to me, and I want to kind of break this down and look at our culture from a new lens, a new perspective, that we don't actually explore these fundamental questions of existence that often, particularly not in the schooling, educational systems, or common conversation amongst families, or there's no kind of practice or custom or cultural tradition that really, as far as I'm aware, practice this understanding. And something that you said, which I'm curious to explore, and what I hear often when I interview Dr. Bruce Lipton, he spoke about this time when we lived in this more animism, which was having this sacred reverence for all of life. So understanding that there is this energy, or this spirit, this source, this intelligence that lives in all beings, all things, all life. And what you said exactly, that we do not create energy, or it does not die, but simply transforms and it changes. And so based upon that knowing, it seems to me that the death process, the death of the human body, or the death of an animal, or the death of the rainforest of a tree, death of a business, or death of a career, is potentially, or even a death of an empire, thinking about back through the ages, that it is a process of change and transformation. And so what can we expect, talking about death and transformation and change, can come about from the evolution of that process of life?
like that. And just kind of for anybody watching, we kind of make loose notes about what to talk about, but I really like the way you just brought that around to one of the points that we had on the list to discuss, because I think that's hugely relevant in this modern life, especially when we have these ideas of pandemics and loss and death and fear, and they're so tied up together that and I really think in a very, very anti-human fashion. And what you're saying there about animism and old concepts around death, I mean, if you think about all these little parts of the puzzle that are now being shifted around, and I think in ways that are really destructive and anti-human. So for example, every old person goes into an old person's home, and well, not quite, but to a certain extent, and then they die. And afterwards, then we come in at the end, after the funeral parlor has managed everything. So not only do we have that disconnection from older wisdom, which we should have on tap for our grandkids, and we have this pervasive and negative theme that once you're past a certain age, you have to retire and get out of the system because you're useless. And we are just, I think, destroying these great, great assets. And I was talking to this with a friend earlier today. We then put these people in these homes where they're given this substance that passes as food. It's dead. It's got no life. It's got no vibrancy. We have all these old age illnesses. There's story after story of people with old age illnesses like dementia, etc., and people are actually just changing their nutrient input, and these conditions are reversing. We don't hear about this because it's anecdotal. It's not recorded in the block of science, so it doesn't exist. Okay, so the point I kind of often segue, but to get back to what you were saying before, in a traditional format, we would have a family that would go on what should or could be a beautiful journey of a transition to another phase, for want of a better word. And as a child, we would be engaged in that experience, whether it was an older grandparent or a great grandparent, and we would have that, I guess, that love and that beauty around the death experience in our subconscious and even in our consciousness. And I think this relates back to things like scarcity and fear and loss, and not having this journey now with us as a community. This impacts greatly on this whole concept of COVID, for example, because we're not conditioned with the beautiful experience of transition. This idea that COVID puts in front of us of ripping our life away, and there is an end and there's finality, that comes with it this fear of loss, which comes with it just all these unhealthy frameworks that are set up behind that.
Yeah, that's really a good point you make. And I guess the way that I can perceive it from my perspective is that, and from my understanding of the way nature operates and the way the universe functions, is that everything works in cycles. And the phases that you talk about, as we move through these cycles, we transition from one area of life into another. And so the death process, which, you know, could look like a death of the physical human body, could look like the death of an empire again, or the death of a job, or even from my perspective, there's the death of these beliefs that I had, and like the letting go of those limiting beliefs and fears around that whole transitional process, and then can be rebirthed or reborn with a new perspective, which is like a new life, a new understanding into how the systems function on a fundamental level. And what I mean by those systems is the seasons, as an example. Like there's a start and an end of summer, for example. But that doesn't mean that the summer is gone. It still comes back around in a cycle. And that might seem kind of a little irrelevant, but what I'm curious to explore, but based upon as well your experience working in that space as a nurse, what was the biggest lesson that you learned from working with death on a constant basis?
The biggest, I think I just couldn't answer that. Which lessons have I learned and which ones stand out? I think as you kind of progress through life, some lessons that you remember kind of tend to jump out at you, and then you kind of forget them and you get a little bit sidelined, and then another one kind of jumps in. But I think for me, the connection between fear and death, and we had a discussion pretty recently about there's a difference between the fear of death and the fear of how you might die. So, for example, I think the analogy was used, if somebody held a gun to your head, is that got to be fearful? Yeah, of course it is. That's different to the fear of actually that dying process. And I think for me, the idea that life in this dimension as we see it now is finite means that at times, and I don't like it when I forget this lesson, but it's a reminder to cherish life and to cherish what you're doing. And this beautifully kind of circles around into what you were saying before. When we have symbolically death of certain areas that we're in, so again, a loss of a business or a loss of a relationship or a loss of a concept, this to me can be the end and something terrible and something grim or something disastrous, or it can be just the perfect opportunity for rebirth. And I think this is, I think it's a powerful message that needs to be in the forefront of our consciousness in this time where we have so many examples of actual death in some circumstances, what we conceive as death, and then these analogies of death in relation to loss of situation. So I think that one of the strongest messages I would want to be putting out there with this conversation is that absolutely death can be accepted. You can grieve. You can allow yourself to grieve. But if you're physically alive, that's life, and you can cherish that, and you can have the most tremendous opportunity for a rebirth in the form of your own making.
Wow. That's huge, man. I love that. That's a powerful message to send out to the world. And on that note, I just wanted to say a big hello to Jabaru, who's just sending us a few comments there, who is a deaf doula, and she's a magnificent woman who can help people through that process. Just wanted to acknowledge you, Jabaru. Thanks for tuning in with us. And something that has been, coming up for me, particularly around everything that's going on in the recent world we find ourselves in, is essentially this deeper fear of dying. It's like, and how that can limit us and hold us back from actually living. And it seems like from what you're saying that, and also from my understanding of how the world is operating and how my life as an individual in the collective community plays out, is that this fear of death has a lot to do with the fear of change, or the fear of, like you said, it's not the actual physical how you die. Like, of course, if someone's going to beat you to death or hold a gun to your head and kill you, but the actual process of transitioning into something else, which is something that we have no idea of, something that is, no one can actually tell you what happens after death. So it's so unknown and so uncertain that is the fear that can be holding us back from actually living in the present moment. And something that I find beneficial in the reminders that you're sharing around the lessons that you've learned in working in this industry is, and I guess part of the message that this conversation can really amplify, is that without comprehending or accepting, as you had said, the death transitional process, then we will always be stuck and limited by the fears of not knowing what comes, that will prevent us from actually embodying being fully alive in the present moment. And something for me, particularly over the last few months, it's kind of like, well, the question I've been asking myself, if I was to die tomorrow, what would I do today? And living in that mentality, of course, like there is every chance that I could die tomorrow, but I'm going to make the assumption that I'm going to live 150 years in this lifetime. So I can, plan out certain areas of my life, but to live with that deeper notion of that I'm going to live today as if it was my last is tremendously powerful to break through anything limiting, holding me back. I can actually truly do what I love. I can speak my truth. I can spend time with loved ones. I can, step into my power and follow a career that I actually am passionate about, rather than getting stuck doing something for someone else and living in a really soul destroying lifestyle, it's like, wow, I can be totally liberated if I can come to comprehend the uncertainty over and accept that I have no idea what happens when I die. So I want to live today.
Incredible. I love that. And again, it's a strange way to, not strange, I guess, but I think it's an important consideration. And I, many times over the years, have said exactly this. I've literally seen people's lives being ripped away from them in the most unexpected circumstances. I won't go into particulars, but
share a story. Have you got anything that comes
it's
to mind?
just incredible stories. I mean, one of them was a guy sitting talking to his girlfriend in a town square, and a drunk driver mounts a curb. The square is maybe 5 meters away, and the car launches through the air and lands on the guy's head, and the girl is sitting beside him, and she was fine.
What?
I'm serious. These are actually things that happen. Another guy, quite a haunting one, was this guy around his mid-30s, just from memory, carrying a piano up a stairs, and the piano fell back and hurt his leg. And
on his back,
on his leg, it fell and hurt his leg. So he had a big bruise in his leg. So he went into hospital feeling really sick, and suddenly his leg just started to rot, and he ended up having what's called above hip amputation, which unfortunately means you're going to die just about, because it's really hard to survive with that. So he came back at the end of my shift, which was finishing about 7. He came back at 6:30, and we just had about 2 to 3 hours of just this frantic resuscitation, pumping fluids, adrenaline, and this guy passed. And that was, just a surreal experience. He had some kids, he had a wife, and we had to accept that there was nothing we could do for this guy. So I think, as you said, for me, it's when people pose that question, I could get hit by a bus tomorrow. That for me carries a lot more weight than maybe it might for some other people. And again, I'm human, and I have my, I guess, weaknesses, and I get caught up in stuff. I can get pissed off and whatnot. But I think for me, it's been really pivotal when I've been faced with, I guess, a nexus in my life, to when I know things are not working out for me properly, to have that bravery, and to know that in a year or 2 years, I might not be here. So if in a year's time, would I be happy not having met that challenge or taken that brave step? And as you know, I've taken a few recently. Would I want to be 5 years, 10 years, 16 years, 20 years, whatever it is later, in that same position, never having moved? Or would I rather have faced that fear and done something which can cast me in a totally different direction? And every time I've taken that kind of dramatic step in a fearful direction, has it been scary? Absolutely. Has there been a kind of death process of an old existence and a rebirth into a new one? Absolutely. But has it benefited me? Yes, it has.
It's huge, man. And something I want to just acknowledge you is, having that courage, that bravery to really confront those fears and move through them, face them and explore them instead of running away from them. Because from my experience as well, what you resist will persist. And so if you push it away, it's going to at some point come to a breaking point and explode right in front of you, until you actually really have to work through it. And same for me, my experience is that facing those fears, whether it be having those confrontational conversations or moving through old limiting beliefs, it is truly liberating in the sense that once we face those fears and we move through them, we confront them, then there's so much room for growth, so much room for a deeper comprehension of our existence. There's so much more room for conscious evolution. And something that I want to touch on to close out this conversation, what you mentioned earlier around this rebirth, about the next transitional season that evolves from overcoming these fears, and what really it takes to be reborn, or because this is something that in different religious beliefs, that there's this process of being reborn. Jesus Christ came back from the death and came reborn, and so from your perspective and how you can explain it, what does it really take to evolve past the death process and step into this new life, this new perspective, this reborn new experience?
Yeah, it's quite interesting because again, I've got kind of my fingers in lots of little pies, including psychology and whatnot, but it's kind of quite incredible that when we see society, many parts of society are living in this abject fear. So there's a kind of a paradox in a sense of you're living in fear because you want to avoid something fearful. So you're not really achieving anything if you're living in fear, because by definition, you are in the fear state. So what's the difference in transitioning from living in a fear state to moving towards something that you find fearful? It's the same set of chemical components in your body. You're just changing from staying in a fearful state to confronting a fear. So there's no logic in staying here and not moving towards the fearful state, the thing that causes you fear. So for me, one of the key components is trying to find stillness. And the bombardment of activity that we're getting from screens and from messages and from telephone calls, whatever it is, social media, entertainment, etc., prevents us from having that stillness. And there's a certain element of comfort in avoiding the recognition that we're living a fearful life. So if we can find stillness to sit in that place where we look at the fear and realize that there's not probably much difference between living fearfully and facing that source of the fear, then we can move towards the source of the fear. And this is when all wonderful things can happen.
Yeah, nice, man. I really like that. And it's a huge discussion point at the moment. People saying, oh, they keep us people in fear and they can control you better and all of these things. Now, and then people come to this conclusion. They're like, oh, yes, move away from fear, move into love. Einstein talks about there's only two states. There's a state of fear and a state of love, and you get to choose. And for me, that's a little bit too simplified, because from my understanding, we have these deep survival mechanisms that we're afraid of. It's like you don't just run and jump off a cliff. There's a fear there because, deep down psychologically, we know we're going to die if we jump off this cliff, and that goes against the evolutionary progression of life. So the fear, or even the fear of the fire, it's like, oh, don't get too close to it, you'll get burnt. So there's this programming deeply ingrained within us that fear has a function and it serves a purpose, and that maybe the fear is obviously in our mind, because it's been proven so many times the power of the mind and how we're able to overcome some of these fears to evolve past it, like you said, moving towards it and finding the stillness. But I guess my question is, how can we use fear, the fear of death, the fear of change, or the fear of the unknown, the fear of uncertainty, to have a function in the way that it can help us to come closer to being more alive?
Great question, and so many little nuances. So I mean, if it might take a few days to answer it, but so I'll just pick out a few of the nuances. But as you're talking, some people, and then I guess it comes back to what our definitions and how we state things are. And we have platitudes, and sometimes platitudes are really misleading. So there are people, for example, who in circuses who deal with fire. The fact that fire can burn you and you avoid that, does that mean you're actually afraid of it? Or is that something else? Is that having an awareness of the harm it can do without fear? So there's a difference between being aware of something that can harm you and being perpetually afraid of it. And for example, you scuba dive, I scuba dive, I'm an instructor, and I am aware of the power of sharks.
Yeah.
And I would not want to get eaten by a shark. But have I dived with sharks? Absolutely, and they're just incredible. There's a difference between having an awareness of harm and having a fear of it. And if we have pumped into our consciousness continually to be afraid of stuff, then an awareness can manifest into a fear of something. So that's the first thing that I have to clarify.
If I tell you sharks are dangerous, sharks will eat you, sharks will eat you, sharks will eat you, sharks will eat you, then suddenly your awareness becomes your fear.
Absolutely. So this is really, really important. So again, we have an awareness of things like hygiene and things about how contagion works or how it doesn't work. But then to translate that into actually a fear, or to have our fear overtake us, that bails us up, that stops us from moving forward. So this is where the power of sitting still comes into play. The next thing, which I keep on getting back to in some way, which is a very interesting thing, is our bodies have these kind of set chemical directions they move in, and there's almost zero difference between the chemical reactions of fear and excitement. And sometimes we're paralyzed by what we actually think of as fear, and some change or a change in a certain direction. It's not much of a big mental shift to fall from a fear state into an excitement state. So when you have that faster breathing, or that's a great example might be talking to a girl you like, or a boy if you're a girl, or the same sex if that's how you're oriented. And you can decide that rush of chemicals that's in your body is a fearful state that you need to run away from, or you can decide that this is a joy of life. And this is a challenge, and this is something exciting, and it may be something you succeed at or maybe not. So I certainly know which position I would rather be in. We obviously know our fears can overtake us. So to answer your question, the stillness and the contemplation and the working out what's going on is really, really powerful. And there was another part just remind me of that question again.
I forgot.
I forgot where I was going with this one, which is great because the conversation still evolves. So I guess one of the strongest points is we have to be careful about how we are conceptualizing fear.
Yeah.
And we got to have a question mark on, is it really fear? And then if we identify the things that we actually do find fearful, then the next step is sitting in silence, sitting in contemplation, and sitting in stillness, and thinking about what we're going to do with that. And the very pertinent thing for me at present certainly is not pushing for an answer. And the stiller you find yourself, or the stiller you can be, the answers actually come at you.
Yeah, nice. I love that. That's so good. It seems challenging to think, though, if there was a threat immediately, and there might be some fear rising, or you're walking down a dark alley, and there's this eerie feeling of this fear. Would it be relevant then to sit there and think about the answers coming in, or how do you perceive that process of defining if that's fear or excitement, or what is going on? Is that a story made up in my own mind?
No, not at all. And this is where we have this nice little back to the kind of medical area, which I'm not too bad at, is you have these two terms called acute and chronic. And acute means the pointy end or something immediate, and chronic means longer term or ongoing. Yeah. So if you have an acute situation which is going to cause you harm, then you have to navigate a way to deal with that. And then you have your normal response, which invariably we don't have a lot of control over, which is your fight, flight, and freeze response. So depending on what you ate yesterday, or how you got up in the morning, or how much you drank, your activation from that stress can be any one of those three.
Yeah.
And then we have the little kind of segue off that. Let's say you're worried about walking in dark alleyways. If you are doing martial arts 3 times, 4 times a week, your preparedness for something unexpected like that is much better. And the chances are your things like your muscle memory and your ways to react will help you out a little bit better than if you never did anything. Or for example, if you're a lion tamer and you're in Africa, maybe your knowledge of animal behavior might help you out a little bit more. Yeah. So those are things that we have to deal with as they come up based on our previous experience. But it's that chronic stuff. Yeah. This is what we're centered around right now. It will happen maybe tomorrow. Maybe I'm going to die of a virus. Maybe my business is going to close. Maybe that relationship's going to end. This future stuff is the stuff that I think is the stuff we have to have a look at.
Wow, I really like that And just to summarize that in the short version, from what I understand of what you're sharing, is that fear is based in the future. And so to stay out of fear, because it's like, I'm only afraid of, like you said, this relationship breaking up because I'm fear of being alone. Or like you said, that my job got missing, that I fear that I won't be able to earn an income and live, survive. And all of that is based in the future. It's nothing actually based fundamentally in the present moment. It keeps us actually from living in the present. We're so stuck in our heads thinking about all of these things without actually experiencing from our hearts in the embodied, grounded, present moment. So it's like, this is a great conversation because, again, Dennis and I have kind of an idea on the topic we're going to talk about, but then we really just dive into it and we just see where it flows. And ultimately, it's like, to be alive. Going back to the first question I asked you, what does it mean to be alive? How would you answer that now?
I think for me now, based on kind of my experiences, the truest form of being alive is being absolutely in the moment with joy, love, and gratitude.
Whoosh, I love it. Yep, I'm right there with you, brother. I love it.
And it's easy. It's easier said than done. You know, we all are human, and this. But again, let's tack on forgiveness onto the end of that. And if we don't find ourselves living with joy and love and gratitude, we can forgive ourselves, and then we can get back to that beautiful place.
Absolutely, you're totally right. And I just wanted to also acknowledge, Colleen has jumped in there and said, letting go and forgiveness is required for rebirth. Just what you touched on. I love that so much. We got Bernard Sahara on YouTube tuning in saying, good on you, Dennis. Thanks for tuning in, mate. And Jabaru, of course, a beautiful lady, saying that all of humanity is going through what we call the dark night of the soul, a rebirth for us all. Very, very fascinating, interesting topic. So, Dennis, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for joining me in this conversation. And I want to thank you guys for watching, tuning in, listening, or watching this video. Again, please like, share, or even leave us a comment on anything you didn't like, and we'll get back to you. Is there anything you want to close out with, Dennis?
No, listen, fantastic conversation. I even had goosebumps every so often chatting to you about it. So that means we're picking around something that I think has a lot of significance and a lot of importance.
Hugely significant, very relevant, and makes me feel alive.
Joy, love, gratitude, be present, forgive.
Thanks, guys. See you next week.